A search for the best gingerbread cookie leads Julia to her soulmate. A unique love story between two pastry chefs that happens unexpectedly. At the beginning of the movie, we see a small woman with short dark hair whose name is Julia. She is the protagonist of the story. An author and an excellent chef, Julia's been very successful in her job. But will she find the one thing she's missing to honor her mother properly? We see her in her restaurant as she tests different cookies that have been sent to her. A piece of paper that has a smudged recipe written on it lies on the table as Julia is trying to find the exact match for it. Her coworker comes into the kitchen and is surprised to see his boss so early. A buttery smell fills the room and her coworker notices it. She offers him one and says that she has added black pepper to it in hopes that it will be the one. He tries it and says that it's really good but notices Julia's face, and it doesn't look satisfied. Julia says that it isn't the one as she goes to try the other batch. Unfortunately, there is no luck for Julia that night as the cookies don't taste anything like her mother's. A phone notification catches Julia's attention and it's a reminder to meet her publicist in an hour. Her publicist is more than excited to see her as she squeals and calls Julia her favorite cookbook author. She tells Julia that the cookbook is terrific and they're ready to publish it, but there is something else in Julia's mind. Every type of dessert will be included in the book, but the right gingerbread recipe hasn't been found yet. Her publicist says that they have a lot of cookies that will make up for that, plus the Christmas section of the cookie recipes. Julia feels like the cookbook won't be complete without a gingerbread cookie recipe that will resemble her mother's. She wants to try one last method as she has put up ads, asking people for their gingerbread cookie submission. Whoever has the same recipe as her mother's will be featured in the book. Her publicist gives her a short extension and Julia says that she will have the recipe in time for publishing. Going back to work, Julia tries more gingerbread cookies but has no luck. Right as she's about to leave, her coworker hands her a basket of cookies to try. A basket of Homestead baked goods is handed to Julia, and right as she tries a cookie, a look of excitement can be noticed on her face. She takes another bite and says that the cookies are more than good. Julia will be calling them the next day, but she's concerned about leaving the restaurant. Her coworker says that he can handle it and mentions that she has never taken a vacation, so it will be good for her. We are taken to Hampton Grove, Wisconsin, where we see the Homestead Bakery. A tall, muscular man whose name is Chris collects the bills at the front as he enters the bakery. Being the owner of the bakery, he finds himself in a difficult situation as the business has been slow. The opening of a new bakery down the road has affected Chris's bakery. Homestead baked goods are all about tradition and the warmth that comes with it, but the new bakery sells modern desserts and that attracts customers. He gets to the kitchen where his mother Irene greets him, a sweet old woman with lavish gray hair and a beautiful smile. She is making croissants, but Chris tells her that she doesn't have to come early every morning and tire herself. She smiles and tells him that she loves helping him and asks him to stop being so stubborn. Claiming that he has gotten all of his good qualities from her, Irene pokes fun at him. He makes sure she knows that she can take a break, but she tells him that she hasn't taken a break since his birth. Irene has enjoyed a night of cribbage the previous night and Chris asks her all about it. She claims that she got skunked, but her friend Maureen has told her that her daughter will be coming to town. So Irene thinks of setting her up with Chris. He doesn't want to hear it, so she stops but makes sure that he knows the offer still stands. Julia arrives at Hampton Grove and is immediately wowed by the beauty. After getting into the inn, Julia is greeted by a witty and very curious man called Mr. Weaver. He tells her that her reservations have been made and asks what's the purpose of her trip. She says that she's passing by to pick up something and will be going back in 2 days. His curiosity gets the best of him as he asks what she'll be picking up. He immediately apologizes for asking too much once he realizes that Julia is uncomfortable. Julia says that it's fine and tells him that she is a pastry chef writing a cookbook. Shock can be seen on the man's face as he realizes who Julia is. Excitingly, he tells Julia that his wife Vicky is a huge fan of hers and has all of her cookbooks. Vicky owns a boutique across the inn called Elite and Chic Boutique, and the man tells her that she can go there anytime she likes. Julia explains to him that in her new cookbook, she wants to include recipes from people all across the state and share other people's specialties. Mr. Weaver's face drops and he assumes that Julia has come to see the new bakery that has opened instead of the old one. Luckily for him, she doesn't even know about that bakery and tells him that she has come to talk to the owner of Homestead Bakery. He doesn't keep her waiting any longer as he hands her the keys to her room. After settling in, Julia heads her way to the bakery. Immediately, she's wowed by the beauty of the bakery. Different colored shelves and all types of sweets and jams on it lay on them and make the shop look warm. A little girl with long brown hair catches Julia off guard as she asks her whether she likes to eat jam. Julia smiles at the girl and says that she does. She asks the little girl for the owner, and soon after, Mr. Thompson comes out. Julia dramatically congratulates Chris for having the best gingerbread cookie recipe, but he looks at her with confusion. He asks her what she's talking about, and she describes their signature cookie basket, so he knows that she has received their basket after all. He asks his daughter to leave him and Julia so they could talk, and before she does, she makes her father promise to bake with her after the conversation. They are left alone and Julia asks whether he knows what she's talking about, and he says he has no idea. Starting from the top, Julia introduces herself as a pastry chef and mentions her cookbook. Clueless, he looks at her not saying anything, so she continues. His gingerbread cookies are the best and she wants to feature the recipe in her new cookbook. Chris thanks her for the kind words and says that the gingerbread cookies are their bestseller, but he's not interested in publishing the recipe because it is a family recipe. Because she has come from far away, he feels bad and offers her consolation from the bakery. Julia says that she's fine and thanks him for his time before leaving the bakery disappointed. Chris goes to the kitchen and asks Abby and Irene whether one of them has sent Julia a basket of cookies, but they say that they haven't done such a thing. Arriving at the inn, Julia is greeted by a screaming Vicky. She is so excited to see Julia and says that she is her biggest fan. Vicky tells Julia that she has known Chris since he was a little boy and he has been baking cookies since he was a child. Not wanting to tire Julia, Vicky lets her go to her room. But before she does, she lets her know that she has 75% off in her store. Julia thanks them and heads to her room. The next morning, Julia can be seen looking through some pictures of her mother. While looking, she comes across a note that says to always believe in yourself and never give up when it gets hard. These words stick to Julia and she decides that she's going to fight for the recipe. She goes to the bakery and tells Chris that she will change his mind. She offers to do a big promo write-up for the bakery and feature the gingerbread cookies on the cover. Chris is flattered and tries to decline, but he gets interrupted by Irene. And Abby tells him that the bank assistant is asking when the mortgage would be paid. Chris laughs awkwardly and says that he will get back to him. He tells Julia that things have not been well, but he expects more work in the Christmas season. Abby chimes in once more and asks Chris whether they should invite Julia to the cookie decoration the next day. Chris assumes that Julia is too busy to do some basic cookie decorating, but Julia says that she will come. Assuming that there is a money issue in the bakery, Julia offers to help. But Chris tells her that the bakery needs a boost in business. After some thinking, Julia offers them help to increase their sales by 50% by Christmas, but wants the recipe in return. Chris agrees and Julia says that she needs a day to come up with some ideas. Even though Chris thinks it's impossible, he agrees as he hopes that the bakery would have customers again. Later on, at night, Julia receives a text from her publicist saying that she has 2 weeks to finish the book. Smiling happily, Julia knows that she will have to make the impossible possible and publish the perfect gingerbread recipe in her book. The next day, Julia goes to the bakery for cookie decorating and sees Abby waiting for her. All of the people go quiet as Chris begins the ceremony. They will be working with royal icing and will have the freedom in choosing the colors. Julia looks at the tray of cookies Abby has made and is impressed by how good the little girl is. Abby looks at Julia's tray and asks why there isn't any color, and Julia tells her that they're snowflakes. Chris comes to them shortly and compliments their cookies, saying that they look like decorations, but Abby says that they're not, as she takes a bite from one of them. After the cookie decoration ceremony is over, Julia, Chris, and Irene sit down to talk. Julia says that their sales have been fine up until 6 months ago when the new bakery opened. The customers started going there because the bakery has a more modern approach, opposite of the classic approach Homestead has. Julia's conclusion is that they need to come up with some new innovative desserts for their customers to try and see what works. Keeping the classic desserts but adding a twist to them will be perfect to draw the customers in. Chris and Irene agree on trying new things and Julia tells them that she will come back with some interesting ideas. Before leaving, Julia asks for directions to Vicky's boutique, and Irene warns her to save some time because Vicky is a talker. After shopping at Vicky's store, Julia comes back to the inn. She is greeted by Mr. Weaver, who asks her how her day has been. Julia says that she's had a hectic day, but everything was sorted out in the end. Mr. Weaver says that the family can be a lot and asks Julia whether she has kids on her own. Julia says that she hasn't found the one yet, so Mr. Weaver tells her that she'll know when the right one comes. Touched by the words, Julia says that her mother used to say the same thing to her. Mr. Weave says that the holidays can be tough when the ones you love aren't around, but it's good to remember them during such times. He asks Julia whether there are any traditions they used to do with her mother, and she tells him about the gingerbread cookies and the gingerbread pudding. Right after saying that, a bright idea comes to Julia. She thanks Mr. Weaver for solving all of her problems before she leaves in a hurry. Walking into the store, Julia tells Irene that she has come up with an idea for the sales. Chris isn't at the bakery, so she takes the time to thank Irene for hearing her out and convincing Chris to hear her as well. Irene admits that her son is stubborn but will do the right thing if one's patient with him. Chris and Abby come into the store, so Julia tells them all about the 12 treats of Christmas. She has come up with an idea to sell traditional desserts with a twist for 12 days, one new item every day in time for Christmas. Abby thinks that it's an amazing idea, and Irene agrees. Chris thinks it's a great idea to bring different inventions such as gingerbread cheesecake, lattes, and mousse, but he is worried about their promotion. Julia assures him that she will handle it as she has some tricks up her sleeve. After some thinking, Chris finally agrees and they go to the kitchen to come up with some desserts. Julia ticks off gingerbread cinnamon buns as a dessert among many, after working in the kitchen for a little while. Abby tries to grab a cookie, but Irene tells her that she has had enough. Annoyed, Abby puts down the cookie and asks Chris whether they can play outside. Irene offers to take her outside, but Abby comes up with a different idea. She invites Julia to a snow war, and Julia asks her what that is. Chris looks at her and after a while asks Julia whether she has half an hour to spare. Abby chimes in and says that taking a break is good for their mental health, so Julia agrees to take a break for half an hour. They go outside, and Abby explains to Julia that the game is just like hide and seek, but you can throw shovels and snowballs. Chris seeks and the girls hide. The game begins and Abby takes Julia to one of the snow walls. She tells Julia that they have to hide and try not to get hit by a snowball, but make sure to throw snowballs at Chris. Chris starts throwing snowballs and accidentally hits Julia's face, which results in the girls throwing even harder. They enjoy the game for a while and return back to the house after. Abby goes to bed and Chris apologizes to Julia for playing for so long. Julia smiles and says that she had fun. She tells him that they will be working on more desserts in the morning and asks Chris to think about poster ideas before she leaves. When she comes back to her room, Julia receives a phone call from her publicist saying that she has to finish the book by the original deadline, which is 10 days, as the company has dismissed her request. Julia accepts the challenge but asks her publicist for 12 days, so her plan about the 12 treats of Christmas is finished and she can get the recipe. Exhausted, Chris and Julia try to think of more ideas for the Christmas ceremony, and have come up with 7 desserts. Not being able to come up with more ideas, the duo sets on coming up with more ideas as the ceremony progresses. Julia tells him that they will need to work on the promo ideas and asks Chris whether he has some ideas in mind. But he looks at her in awe and asks how she knows about that stuff. She admits that the restaurant business is competitive in Chicago and she had to learn to brand herself. Her baking is her happiness and she loves sharing happiness through food. When someone comes to her restaurant, they get to enjoy comfort food with a twist, but familiar and satisfying flavors. Chris says that they're lucky to have her and shows her a poster Abby had made. Julia says that she loves them and asks whether people from different shops will want to hang them. He jokes and says that if she were to ask, they must. Vicky is the first that hangs up the poster and Julia thanks her for it. In Chicago, they would have been charged for such a promotion, and that's why Vicky was happy to leave. She wants to help people because she wants to do good, not get paid. Surprised, Julia admits that she didn't know Vicky used to reside in Chicago. Vicky had worked in a shop similar to hers but moved because she wanted to open her own shop. She asks Julia whether the town is growing on her and Julia says that it's been fun but she's trying to figure out the campaign with Chris. Surprised that she's even in a campaign with Chris, Julia admits that he wasn't thrilled to meet her at the beginning. A change of heart happened to Chris and Vicky says she's happy to hear that as he's been struggling with the death of his wife 4 years ago. Julia didn't know about the wife, so Vicky stops and says that it was not her story to tell. Vicky heads back to work and says that she has a radio appearance later on. When she says that her nephew hosts the radio station, a genius idea comes to Julia's mind. Rushing back to the bakery, Julia finds Chris and asks him to come with her. A beautifully decorated radio station is where Julia takes Chris and says that he has to thank Vicky for the opportunity. Seamus is the owner of the station, a very focused and indulged DJ who Chris already knows. Nervousness fills Chris and he admits to Julia that he has butterflies in his stomach. Julia is surprised to find out that he hasn't done radio before, as Chris says that he's never done something like it. Taking it to step by step, Julia explains that they will have an ad play every day of the event as she hands him a script with what he has to say. The first few lines are like the song 12 Days of Christmas, so Julia asks Chris to sing them. He is a bit insecure about his singing, as he claims that he's not a rock star but a baker. Julia tells him that it doesn't matter whether he can sing or not, but what matters is confidence. It takes a while to learn how to promote yourself, and Julia knows that as she tried and failed many times before learning what's right to do. Her words help Chris relax, and he says that he's ready. He reads the script and gets a hold of it fast. Calling all customers to try their 12 new and delicious delights for the holidays, Chris claims that everyone will feel at home. After finishing the radio announcement, Chris and Julia put up some posters all around town and go back home in the evening. They sit down for a cup of hot cocoa as they wait for the weather to calm, so Julia can head back to the hotel. Chris is concerned about the snow as he thinks it will stop the people from coming into the bakery, but Julia says that nothing can stop the people and their love for dessert. Julia's done a lot and spent a chunk of her time helping Chris, so he can't help but wonder why she wants the recipe so badly. Giving him the whole answer, Julia admits that the cookies taste the same as her mother's and she is the one who taught her how to bake. Her mother used to watch cooking shows with her and Julia found it rather interesting when they tried and failed different recipes. Chris asks what happened to her mother's recipe and Julia says that the cookbook her mother had left her was smudged and destroyed, among them being the gingerbread recipe. Feeling sad, Chris apologizes for asking but Julia says she has already accepted the fact that is gone. The snowstorm has cleared, so Julia heads her way back. She puts her coat on and Chris helps her with the scarf. Day 1 of 12 Treats of Christmas officially starts and the outback is more than amazing. Crowds of people fill the small bakery, all asking for a gingerbread delight, After finishing the orders, Chris joins Julia in her conversation with Mr. Waver and Vicky. They ask Julia what dessert it will be the next day, so Julia tells them that it will be gingerbread vanilla fudge. Vicky says she loves fudge and even asks for a free sample, but Chris tells her that they haven't made it yet. Mr. Weaver says that he's eating all the treats as a reward for his hard work at the inn. He starts going on about how stressed backward is dessert, and how people who eat more desserts are less stressed. Not wanting him to continue blabbing, Vicky says that it's time to go, so they leave. After closing the bakery, Irene, Julia, and Chris talk about the goals they achieved that day. Chris is shocked that they exceeded their goals, and Irene hopes that they can keep it that way. He's about to leave to put Abby in bed, but Irene stops him and says that she'll do it, as he and Julia have more work to do. Before continuing with work, Chris suggests they take a walk and Julia joins him. While walking around, Chris shows Julia all the different shops and places she can go to while being there. He says that he knows everyone in the town and it's because of the Hampton Groove charm. The opening of the new bakery and the other big franchises has hurt the community as all the people in the town are like one big family. Chris wants to be honest with Julia, so he says that he has experienced the pain of losing someone as well. He admits that it was hard for him to enjoy anything, even baking, after his wife's death. Julia thanks him for telling her and compliments him on raising such a smart little girl. He smiles and says that she's the boss of him and along with Vicky, the boss of the town. Julia tells him that Vicky had mentioned the haircut story to her, and how Chris had put a bowl on his head and cut his hair. In his defense, he was 7 years old at the time and that haircut was in style. Julia checks her watch and says that they should go back and make the fudge. A concerned look can be noticed on Julia's face, so Chris asks her whether something's wrong. She admits that she never thought about the recipe and how much weight it had in Chris's family. She's not sure whether she would publish the recipe, even if Chris was to give it to her, because she feels bad about exploiting some families' traditions. Chris admits that there are 2 reasons he didn't want to give the recipe to her, one being that it is the most popular treat in the bakery and he doesn't say the other one. He almost says it but stops himself as if he's hiding something. Julia reassures him that people reading the book will try the recipe, fall in love with it, and come to the shop for the original flavor. Chris asks her to increase the sales and promises to give her the recipe. Even though Julia feels bad, she knows that it's his decision at the end of the day. Day 2 of the wonderful ceremony comes, but Chris and Julia find themselves without any customers. Chris is doubtful of the fudge, but Julia tells him not to doubt it. Being scared that it was just beginner's luck, Chris asks Julia why there aren't people coming. But Julia says that they will be just in time for lunch. Their conversation is interrupted as customers come into the bakery to get their goods. Their week goes by smoothly with loads of customers coming in to get different delights every day. Day 8 comes and Chris is surprised how many people love cake pops, but Julia has one more surprise for him. She has asked the radio station to play their ad even more, so from that day on the ad will be played twice a day. The phone rings and Julia answers it. Irene tells Julia that Abby had a bellyache but is good now, and they are at home watching cartoons. Julia hangs up the call and tells Chris, so he decides to go and check on Abby himself, and will be back shortly. Before he leaves, he asks Julia whether they can break the pattern they've been having. Good days are followed by slow days and Chris wants to change that. Days 9, 10, and 11 go smoothly with a lot of customers and sales. Day 12 comes and the duo prepares for the final desserts. Abby asks Julia if she can teach her how to make a delicious cake after Christmas, but Chris says that Julia will have to go home. Surprisingly, Julia says that she can extend her stay after clearing it with her restaurant. Irene takes Abby home, so Julia and Chris stay at the bakery. He asks her whether she's really staying and she asks whether that's okay with him, saying that it will be lovely to have her around. Chris looks at Julia with hope in his eyes. Not knowing what the next treat will be and having little time to do one, the duo tries to come up with a dessert that will be fit for the grand finale. Chris suggests they make big gingerbread sandwiches with cream cheese filling on the inside. Julia thinks it's a genius idea as it is both tasty and fun looking. Thinking of a way to advertise the sandwich, Julia asks Chris about his connections at the news station, and soon enough the interview that will change everything will be done. The next day, which is the 12th day of treats, a camera crew can be seen at the bakery. Nervous, Chris asks Julia what to say and she tells him to talk about the unusualness of the cookie. She suggests they practice and advises him to speak from the heart. The practice interview begins, and Julia asks Chris how the campaign has been going, to which he answers great because he's met some new and interesting people. The desserts have been delightful, but he's most excited about the final dessert. His daughter inspires him to bake as she puts love into everything she does. Julia says that the interview had been great and claims that he is ready. Before she goes, Chris hands her a note and she is surprised to see the recipe when she opens it. She isn't sure whether to take it or not because they don't know if the sales are going to reach the goal. Chris tells her that she has done a lot for his business and family and the recipe is a way of him thanking her. Irene interrupts their moment and wishes Chris good luck before the crew comes and takes Chris with them. The interview starts and Chris slips up in the beginning due to his nervousness, but redeems himself once he starts talking about the desserts. He introduces the final dessert as a twist on the signature gingerbread cookie sandwich. The reporter asks him what's so signature about it, and Chris says it's Irene's recipe, and he has been making it with her since he was a child. In the meantime, Julia receives a text from her coworker, and it's something about them having troubles at the restaurant. She steps aside and calls the restaurant, which seems to be in a chaotic state. Her coworker answers but hangs up quickly as he has a fire to put out. Julia is concerned about the restaurant now, but her thoughts are interrupted by a call from her assistant. Another miss in communication has happened, and Julia needs to send the recipe by the morning or they will publish without it. She has to attend a meeting in the morning to sign the final copy of the book, so she promises her assistant that she will leave the next morning. Irene startles Julia, and she has heard her conversation. Chris will be disappointed, but if she were to explain her situation to him, he would understand. Julia feels awful that she has to leave because Chris had just given her the recipe and told her the meaning behind it. Irene tells her that Chris used to make the cookies with his wife and Abby as it was their family's specialty. She hands her a pile of letters and claims to tell her the truth with them. When Julia reads who the letters are from, tears build in her eyes, and a big secret is unraveled. Chris finishes the interview and Julia comes out to congratulate him. She wants to tell him about the phone call, but he doesn't let her, as he wants to say something to her first. He says that she has come into his life so suddenly in the best way possible, and helped him rebuild his business. She has helped him let his guard down and let someone in his life. Abby loves her, and he hasn't felt like that about someone in a long time. Before he asks the grand question, Julia cuts him off and says that she needs to leave in the morning. Confused, he asks whether something's wrong, but she tells him that she has to go and sign the final copy of the book because she has gotten his recipe. He can't believe the words that are coming out of her mouth and the fact that she is already on the run with the recipe. She knows what it looks like and knows the weight of the recipe, but Chris is hurt that even after knowing the worth, she has decided to leave. Not wanting to continue the conversation, Chris tells her to go back to Chicago and that he will take care of the final day. Julia comes down the stairs with her suitcase the next morning, and the Weavers greet her. She tells them that she's leaving early, but they can keep the payment. Mr. Weaver doesn't want her money and even offers to keep a room for her in case she changes her mind. Vicky comes after Julia and asks whether she wants to talk about it. Julia feels as if she ruined everything with Chris as tears fall down her cheeks. Vicky hugs her and says it's funny how life can throw unexpected love at you. Julia says that she's going home with a resolution and plans to focus only on that. She asks Vicky whether she can visit next year, and she tells her that there will always be room for her available. Irene finds Chris in the kitchen beating a dough and taking all of his anger on it. She decides to be honest with him and admits that she was the one that sent the cookie basket to Julia in the first place. She admits that she knew who Julia was and she had known her mother from a cookbook club back in the 70s. They had exchanged recipes and would write to each other a few times a year. Irene had come across Julia's book and researched Julia, which led her to find out who Julia really was. Chris says that it must be a coincidence, but Irene says that their recipe is just a little bit different from her mother's. She admits that sharing recipes with Julia's mother made her so happy, as there's something so beautiful about sharing what you enjoy with your loved ones. She says that Chris has been teaching Abby that sharing is important since she was little, so sharing his recipe can only do good. Chris asks why she didn't tell him earlier, and Irene says that she knew how stubborn he can get. Irene asks him what he's going to do about Julia, and Abby chimes in, saying that he isn't perfect either. Chris deserves to be happy, and the girls support him when it comes to Julia. Running out of the bakery, Chris hopes that he will be able to catch Julia before she leaves. He goes to the inn and asks about Julia. Unfortunately, Mr. Weaver tells him that she left 20 minutes ago. Devastated, Chris leaves the inn without catching Julia. On her way to the airport, Julia calls her coworker to tell him that she's coming back to Chicago. He says that the restaurant is fine, but when she called, it was a busy night, so that's why he couldn't talk to her. She says she's coming back either way, but her coworker suggests she enjoys her vacation longer. Hanging up the call, Julia hears the ad about the bakery on the radio, and that changes her mind. When Chris comes to the bakery, he sees Julia and she asks him whether they can talk in private. Julia realized that she was searching for a place to call home, a feeling of warmth, and that's what Chris, Abby, and Irene meant to her. She apologizes for leaving things the way she did and promises to call her publisher if he didn't want the recipe to be included, as she would rather lose the recipe than lose him. He says that she doesn't have to do that, and the main reason he didn't want to share the recipe is that he didn't want her to leave. He admits that he had felt betrayed when she told him she was going back to Chicago, but claims that it's his fault for feeling that way. He was reminded that sharing is all about experiencing things with the person they love, and that's what makes it special. He tells her that she is an incredible person, and he couldn't have been able to do the campaign without her. They stare into each other's eyes before Chris leans in and they share a kiss, but of course, Irene interrupts them again as she asks them to come to the front to see something. A crowd of people has filled the bakery, and Chris is more than shocked about it. They stare in awe as Irene tells them that half of the people have come from other towns. Their hard work has paid off and the business is thriving. Chris asks Julia whether she has to go back to Chicago for the meeting, but she tells him that she has sent every document her publisher needed and would rather be with him. Before getting back to work, Chris kisses Julia once more, and Abby hugs them. The recipe has been found and two people have fallen in love, the perfect ending to a beautiful story.